I thought I was just tired from a long shift, that the flicker of movement behind the curtain was a trick of the evening light. I had no idea that the shadow in my window belonged to a woman who had been inside my house for 3 hours, methodically going through every drawer, every box, every hidden corner, looking for something she believed was rightfully hers. And I had absolutely no idea that the man I had loved for 7 years had given her a key. That detail, the key, is the one that still catches in my throat when I think about it now. Not the theft, not the lies, not even the months of quiet manipulation that had been building like pressure behind a dam. The key. Because you don't give someone a key to a house by accident. You do it on purpose. You do it in advance. You do it knowing exactly what they are going to use it for. And Daniel had looked me in the eyes that very morning over our coffee mugs and kissed me on the forehead and told me to have a good day, all while knowing his mother was going to let herself into our home the moment my car turned the corner. Let me take you back. Let me show you what life looked like before I knew any of this, because it matters. The before matters, not as nostalgia, but as evidence of how completely and deliberately I was kept in the dark. We had bought the house on Callaway Street 3 years earlier, when Daniel's business finally started turning a profit, and my salary at the hospital administration office gave us enough stability to qualify for the mortgage. It was a narrow Victorian with pale yellow siding and a wraparound porch that I had loved the moment I saw it. The previous owners had left behind a lilac bush in the backyard that bloomed every May in enormous purple clusters, and on warm evenings, the scent drifted through the kitchen window while I cooked, and Daniel sat at the island with a glass of wine, telling me about his day. Those evenings felt like something I had earned, like the specific, quiet reward for years of budgeting carefully and working overtime, and believing that if you were patient enough, the life you wanted would eventually arrive. The house was mine in a way that felt almost cellular. I had chosen the paint colors, a warm ivory in the living room, a soft slate blue in the bedroom. I had spent 3 weekends stripping the old linoleum from the kitchen floor myself, hands raw and back aching, until the original hardwood appeared underneath like something rescued. Daniel had helped, nominally, handing me tools and making sandwiches, but the vision had been mine, the labor had been mine, and the mortgage was, functionally, mine. My name first on the deed, my credit score that had tipped the approval, my salary that formed the backbone of our monthly payments. Daniel's mother, Margaret, had visited twice since we moved in. The first time, she had stood in the doorway of the kitchen and surveyed the renovations with an expression I had read as appreciation, but later understood was appraisal. She had run her fingers along the restored countertop and said, very quietly, "Your grandmother would have kept this place beautifully." It had seemed like a compliment. I had thanked her. I had offered her tea. I had tried, as I always tried with Margaret, to find the warmth I was certain must be hidden somewhere beneath the stiff, evaluating surface of her. The second visit, she had asked to see the bedroom. Not in a strange way. She framed it as wanting to see how the renovation had turned out on the upper floor. But she had lingered in the doorway of the closet, and she had noticed, too quickly I now realized, the small wooden jewelry box on the top shelf. "Is that rosewood?" she had asked. And I had said yes, it had been my grandmother's. And she had nodded, just once, with an expression I could not read, and then she had moved on to asking about the bathroom tile. My grandmother Vera had died 4 years before Daniel and I married. She had been a small, fierce woman who smelled of lavender and kept her opinions direct and her loyalties absolute. She had left me 3 things: the rosewood jewelry box, the strand of pearls that had been her mother's, and a handwritten note tucked inside the velvet lining of the box that read simply, "These are yours. Don't let anyone talk you out of them." I had read that note at 26 and thought it was just the kind of thing grandmothers said. Gentle, slightly dramatic, rooted in an older world where women had to fight harder to hold on to what was given to them. I had not understood until the evening I came home to a shadow in my window that my grandmother had perhaps known something I did not. The pearls were worth, as far as I had ever determined, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. Not a fortune, but significant. More significant than the money, though, was what they represented. My grandmother had emigrated with almost nothing. The pearls had been one of the few things she brought with her, hidden in the lining of a coat, and they had passed from her mother to her to me with the specific gravity of things that have survived when everything else was lost. I wore them to my wedding. I wore them the day I was promoted to senior administrator. They were not decorative to me. They were a kind of inheritance I held in trust. Margaret had known about the pearls. How much she had thought about them I couldn't say, but I would learn, eventually, that she had thought about them quite a lot. The weeks leading up to that evening had been unremarkable on the surface and quietly wrong underneath. Daniel had been distracted, checking his phone more than usual, going quiet during dinners in a way that I attributed to stress about his business. He had been dealing with a difficult client, or so he said, and I had given him the space I thought he needed, the same way you loosen your grip on a fist that's too tight. We had not argued. We had barely spoken, actually, and I had begun to mistake silence for peace. Margaret had called twice in that period. I knew because I saw her name on Daniel's screen, once when he left his phone on the kitchen table, and because I heard him speaking in the low, careful voice he used when he didn't want to be overheard, standing at the far end of the garden with his back to the house, pacing in a small, tense circle. When I asked who he had been talking to, he said, "Just Mum. She's been having a hard time." I did not press. I was tired. I was working long hours. I had a presentation to prepare for the following Friday and a staff scheduling crisis that was eating my evenings. I had no bandwidth to notice what I should have noticed. And perhaps that was also something that had been counted on. The evening of October the 14th, I left the hospital at 6:30 instead of the usual 8. The presentation had gone well, my manager had let us go early, and I had a specific, simple pleasure ahead of me. I was going to stop at the bakery on Fernwood and buy the almond croissants that Daniel liked, and we were going to sit on the porch in the last of the autumn light, and things were going to feel normal again. I had been planning this small gesture since noon. That is the particular cruelty of ordinary happiness, how much planning it takes, and how easily it can be shattered. I turned onto Callaway Street at 6:45. The evening light was doing what it does in October in our neighborhood, going amber and horizontal, catching in the leaves that had turned but not yet fallen, making everything look briefly like a painting of itself. I was thinking about nothing more complicated than croissants. And then I looked up at our house and saw the shadow move behind the living room curtain. My first thought was that Daniel had come home early, but his car was not in the driveway. His car was not on the street. The driveway was empty, and the front door was closed. And every rational part of my mind told me that no one should be in that house. I sat in my car at the curb for a long moment, watching the window. The curtain was still. The amber light played against the glass. And then the shadow moved again, deliberate, unhurried, moving from the left side of the room to the right, with the calm confidence of someone who believed they had time and privacy. The cold that moved through me then was not quite fear. It was something more disorienting than fear, the specific vertigo of a world that is not behaving the way it should. I reached for my phone and called Daniel. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sat there with the phone in my hand and the engine still running and the shadow still moving inside my house, and I made the decision to go in. I did not call the police. In retrospect, I understand why that instinct failed me, because some part of me, some deep and wordless part, had already begun to suspect that what I was about to find was not a stranger. The shadow moved like someone who knew where the furniture was. I took my keys out quietly. I went up the porch steps. I turned my key in the lock, and I pushed the door open to find Margaret standing in the middle of my living room, holding the rosewood jewelry box in both hands, with the lid open and the strand of pearls draped across her palm. She did not flinch when she saw me. That was the first thing I registered. Not guilt, not surprise, not even the performance of innocence. She looked up from the pearls with an expression of someone who had been interrupted during a perfectly reasonable task, and she said, in the same tone she might use to comment on the weather, "Kate, you're home early." The room tilted. I gripped the doorframe. The jewelry box was open. The pearls were in her hand. The drawer of the side table, where I kept documents, letters, small things of significance, was pulled out and its contents were spread across the cushion of the armchair in an arrangement that was clearly not accidental. She had been through everything. "What are you doing?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. It was not calm. It was the voice of a person whose volume controls have temporarily failed. "I came to pick up a few things," Margaret said. She closed the lid of the jewelry box with a small, precise click, and she set it down on the coffee table, as though placing it there for safekeeping. "Daniel said it would be fine. He was supposed to be home by now." She looked at her watch, actually looked at her watch, as if Daniel's tardiness were the mildly inconvenient problem in the room. "He gave you a key." It was not a question. The logic of it had already assembled itself in the 2 seconds since I walked through the door, and it landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. "Of course he did," Margaret said. "I'm his mother." I looked at the pearls still resting in her palm. I looked at the open drawer. I looked at the jewelry box sitting on my coffee table as though it had already changed ownership in her mind. And I said, very carefully, "Put them down." She looked at me for a long moment with an expression that was not quite contempt, something more measured than that, something that had been practiced. Then she set the pearls on top of the jewelry box with the slow deliberateness of someone who wants you to know that they are complying as a courtesy, not because they are required to. "We should talk," she said. "There are some things I've been meaning to discuss with you." "We should wait for Daniel," I said. "Yes," she agreed. "We should." She sat down on my sofa, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. And I stood in my own doorway, in my own house, and tried to remember how to breathe. Daniel arrived 22 minutes later. I know because I watched the clock on the mantelpiece the entire time, the old brass one that had belonged to my grandfather, sitting beside the rosewood jewelry box, and the irony of those two objects together on that surface was not lost on me, even then. 22 minutes of sitting across from Margaret in my own living room while she made calm, unhurried small talk about the weather turning cold and whether we had thought about replacing the porch railing before winter. 22 minutes of me answering in monosyllables, my hands folded in my lap to keep them still, my jaw aching from the effort of keeping my face neutral. The pearls lay on the lid of the jewelry box between us like a piece of evidence at a trial. When I heard Daniel's key in the lock, the relief was instantaneous. And then, within 2 seconds of seeing his face, the relief curdled into something worse. He did not look surprised. He looked the way people look when they arrive at a situation they have been dreading but knew was coming. A tight jaw, eyes that went immediately to his mother, a brief and involuntary micro-expression of checking, "Is it already happening?" He stood in the doorway with his coat still on and his keys in his hand, and he looked at the jewelry box, and he looked at his mother, and then, finally, he looked at me. "Kate," he said, and nothing else. "Tell me about the key," I said. He took his coat off. He hung it on the hook by the door with a careful, deliberate slowness that bought him perhaps 4 seconds. Then he sat down on the arm of the chair and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." Margaret shifted on the sofa. "Daniel, I think we should just explain." "Let him speak," I said, and something in my voice made her stop. Daniel looked at me with an expression that was unhappy and ashamed and, underneath both of those things, something else. Something I would only fully identify later, when I had time and distance to examine it clearly. He looked like a man who had made a calculation and was now discovering that his arithmetic had been wrong. "Mom has been asking," he said slowly, "about your grandmother's things. For a while now." He paused. "She says that the pearls were originally purchased by my grandmother, that she lent them to your grandmother decades ago, and that they were never returned." I stared at him. What? I know how it sounds. Daniel, that is not true. My voice was still quiet, but the quietness had a different quality now. The way a very cold surface is quiet. The way ice is quiet before it breaks. Those pearls belong to my grandmother's mother. She brought them from Europe. I have photographs. I have letters. There is a paper trail going back 80 years. She has different documentation, Margaret said, and when I turned to look at her, she was calm, utterly calm, with her hands folded and her posture perfect, and I understood, in that moment, with absolute clarity, that she had been preparing for this conversation for a very long time. She reached into the bag beside her on the sofa and produced a manila folder. She opened it on her knee and held it out toward me with the air of someone presenting incontrovertible evidence. My mother's purchase receipt from 1951, a letter in which your grandmother acknowledges borrowing them, and a photograph of my mother wearing them at a family gathering in 1953. The room went very still. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I could hear a car passing on Callaway Street. I took the folder from her hands and looked at the documents inside. A receipt, yellowed and creased, for a pearl necklace purchased from a jeweler in the city. A handwritten letter in faded blue ink. A black and white photograph of a woman I did not recognize, smiling at a table set for celebration, wearing what appeared to be a strand of pearls. My hands were completely steady. I do not know how. The steadiness felt borrowed from somewhere, like a coat that wasn't mine. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "They've been in my possession for years," Margaret said. "I've been meaning to address this for a very long time, Kate. I want you to understand. This isn't personal. This is simply about returning something that belongs to my family." I set the folder down on the coffee table. I set it down with the kind of deliberate care you use when you are afraid of what you might do if you stop being careful. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the floor. "Did you know about this?" I asked him. "These documents. Did you know she had them?" The pause before he answered was not long, maybe 3 seconds. But 3 seconds is a very long time when you are watching someone decide whether to tell you the truth. "She showed them to me last month," he said. Last month. Last month, when he had been distracted, when he had been pacing in the garden with his phone, when I had been working late on a presentation and giving him space, and assuming that the silence between us was stress, not conspiracy. Last month, while I was making coffee in the morning and kissing him goodbye and trusting the life we had built together, he had been sitting with his mother's documents and her plan and her certainty, and he had said nothing. "Last month," I repeated. "Kate, I didn't know what to do. She seemed so sure. She broke into our house, Daniel." My voice cracked on the last word, just once, and then it sealed over again. "She used a key you gave her without telling me, and she went through our belongings, and she was holding my grandmother's pearls in her hand when I walked through the door. Does that seem like something a person does when they have a legitimate legal claim? Or does that seem like something a person does when they are trying to take something before they can be stopped?" Margaret made a soft sound, not quite a sigh, something more crafted than that. "I wasn't taking anything," she said. "I was simply looking. With the lid open and the pearls in your hand. I was examining them to verify what?" I stood up. I had not planned to stand up. My body made the decision before my mind did, and once I was standing, I felt steadier than I had since I walked through the door. To verify that they matched the photograph? To verify that the story you constructed was consistent with the physical object you intended to take? What exactly were you verifying, Margaret? She looked at me with eyes that were cool and patient and entirely unmoved. "I understand that you're upset," she said. "That's natural. But I want to be very clear. If we can't resolve this as a family, I'm prepared to take this to court. I have documentation. I have grounds. And I have the right to recover property that was taken from my mother." The word taken landed like a slap. Taken. As if my grandmother, a woman who had crossed an ocean with almost nothing, who had rebuilt a life from fragments, who had kept those pearls hidden in a coat lining to keep them safe, had been a thief, as if the inheritance I had worn on my wedding day was stolen goods. The nausea that moved through me then was pure and total and had a metallic edge, like the taste of a coin on the back of your tongue. I looked at Daniel one more time. He was still looking at the floor. His shoulders were slightly hunched, the posture of a man who is hoping that if he makes himself small enough, the situation will resolve itself around him. I had seen that posture before, at family dinners when his mother said something barbed about my cooking, at Christmas when she had given me a self-help book with a pointed inscription, in a dozen small moments when I had needed him to stand beside me and he had chosen instead to stand just slightly behind. I had always told myself it was a flaw, not a fault, that he loved me but was not brave, that his inability to confront his mother was a wound in him, not a weapon against me. I had been wrong about that. His silence was not the silence of a man who was lost. It was the silence of a man who had already chosen a side and was hoping he wouldn't have to say so out loud. "I want you to leave," I said to Margaret. My voice had gone somewhere I had not been before, past anger, past hurt, into a register that was flat and final and cold. "I want you to take your folder and leave my house. And Daniel," I turned to him and I made myself look at his face until he looked back at me, "we are going to talk. After she leaves, you and I are going to have a conversation, and you are going to tell me everything. Not the version that's comfortable. Everything." Margaret rose with unhurried dignity. She picked up her folder, she picked up her bag, she looked at the jewelry box on the coffee table, and then she looked at me, and for just a moment, something shifted in her expression. Not defeat, not guilt, but recalculation. The look of a chess player who has lost a piece but not the game. "I hope we can find a resolution that doesn't require lawyers," she said at the door, "for Daniel's sake." "Good night, Margaret," I said. After the door closed, the silence was enormous. Daniel sat on the arm of the chair, and I stood in the center of the room, and neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a wind had come up, and I could hear it in the lilac bush beneath the kitchen window, the dry rustling of branches that had lost their leaves. "How long has she been planning this?" I finally asked. Daniel looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, and I noted this without softening toward it. "A few years, I think," he said. "She started talking about it after your grandmother died. She always said, that your grandmother had taken something that wasn't hers and that she'd waited long enough. And you believed her." "I didn't know what to believe. The documents looked real, Kate." "Did you have them verified?" Silence. "Did you take them to anyone? A lawyer, an appraiser, anyone, to ask whether they were legitimate?" The silence stretched. "You didn't," I said, "because you didn't want to know the answer. Because if someone told you they were forgeries, you would have had to tell her to stop, and you didn't want to do that." I sat down across from him because my legs had begun to feel unreliable beneath me. "So instead you gave her a key, and you said nothing to me, and you let her come into our home." I stopped. I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment. When I took them away, everything was very clear and very still. "I need you to understand what that means to me, not what you intended. I believe that you convinced yourself you were managing a difficult situation. I need you to understand what you actually did. You let someone into the home that I helped pay for and helped maintain and chose and renovated. You let someone in to go through my things and take something that belonged to my grandmother, and you said nothing. Kate, I'm not finished." I looked at him directly. "I am going to find out whether those documents are real, and if they are forgeries, and I believe they are, I am going to take this to the police. And I am going to need to know whether you knew." Something moved across his face, something that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it. "I didn't forge anything," he said. "I know you didn't forge them," I said. "I'm asking whether you knew." He did not answer. And that, in the end, was its own kind of answer. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside a man who had become a stranger to me in the space of an evening, and I listened to his breathing slow and then deepen into sleep. Sleep that came to him with an ease that struck me as almost incomprehensible. And I stared at the ceiling and I thought, with a clarity that only comes when every illusion has been stripped away, about what I needed to do next. My father called at 7 the following morning, which was unusual. He was not a morning caller. He was, in fact, a man of such disciplined emotional restraint that he rarely called without a specific reason, and the fact that he was calling at 7 on a Tuesday told me that something had reached him. When I answered, he said, without preamble, "Are you all right? I had a conversation yesterday that I think you need to know about." My father had, it turned out, received a call from an old friend, a woman named Helen, who had known both my grandmother and Margaret in the years when both families had lived in the same neighborhood, decades ago. Helen had called to ask my father, carefully and with some evident discomfort, whether he had heard that Margaret was claiming ownership of the pearls. She had wanted him to know, she said, because she remembered the pearls very well. She remembered specifically that my grandmother had owned them before she ever met Margaret. She had been at a birthday dinner in 1948, 3 years before the date on Margaret's receipt, at which my grandmother had worn them. She had photographs. Her timeline is wrong, my father said, and she knows it's wrong. I held the phone against my ear and looked out the kitchen window at the lilac bush, bare and gray in the October light, and I felt something shift in me. Not the hot, disorienting surge of the night before, but something colder and more purposeful. The kind of anger that does not shake your hands, but steadies them. "I need a lawyer," I said. "I already called one," my father said. "She can see you this afternoon." The lawyer's name was Patricia Holt, and she had the specific, invaluable quality of someone who has seen every version of this situation before and is not surprised by any of it. I brought her the jewelry box, the photograph of my grandmother wearing the pearls in 1946, which I found after 2 hours of searching in a box of old papers in the spare room, the handwritten note from my grandmother that said, "These are yours. Don't let anyone talk you out of them." I brought her Helen's contact information and the phone photograph I had taken of Margaret's documents before returning them. And Patricia Holt looked at everything, and then she looked at me, and she said, "The receipt is a forgery. The paper is wrong. The aging is artificial, and the jeweler's name on the receipt dissolved in 1947, 4 years before the date on the document. The letter is harder to assess without the original, but the photograph you have of your grandmother wearing these in 1946 predates everything she has by 2 years. Can I go to the police?" "You can, yes. This is fraud and potentially theft by preparation. She was in your home with access to the property in question. Whether the district attorney wants to pursue it is another matter, but you have a credible case." Patricia folded her hands on her desk. "I'd recommend sending a formal cease and desist first. Often that's enough. People who run this type of operation, and this is a type, I've seen variations of it, they depend on the other party being too destabilized to push back systematically. The moment you demonstrate that you are going to push back systematically, the calculus changes. I sent the cease and desist through Patricia's office 2 days later. It detailed the forged receipt, the timeline discrepancy, Helen's account, and my photographic evidence, and it stated clearly that any further contact regarding the pearls, any further unauthorized entry to my home, and any further attempt to claim the jewelry through legal or extra-legal means would result in a criminal complaint filed with the police. I had the locks changed the same afternoon I sent it. Daniel read the letter. He sat at the kitchen island and he read it. And when he finished, he set it down very carefully and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know the receipt was forged." "I believe you," I said, "but you gave her the key anyway. You knew she was coming. You knew what she was looking for." "I thought she had a legitimate claim." "You thought she might have a legitimate claim, and instead of telling me and dealing with it together, you helped her try to take something from our home without my knowledge." I sat across from him. "That is the part I cannot explain away, Daniel. Every other piece of this I might be able to understand, but that, the key, the silence, the 22 minutes I sat across from your mother in my own house, not knowing whether my husband knew she was there, that is not a mistake. That is a choice. He cried eventually. Real tears as far as I could tell, though I had learned by then that my ability to read Daniel's interior life was less reliable than I had believed. He said he was sorry. He said he had been afraid of her his whole life, of her disappointment, of her anger, of the specific, breathtaking guilt she was able to produce in him with a single expression. He said he had told himself that if he just let her try, she would fail on her own and the situation would resolve without confrontation. He said he had been a coward. He used that word himself. I let him talk. I did not interrupt, and when he was finished, I said, "I know you're sorry, and I know this isn't the whole of who you are, but I need you to understand something clearly. If you cannot choose me over her when it matters, then we are not partners. We are two people living in the same house, and I cannot build a life on that." He nodded. He looked wrecked and exhausted and younger than his age. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. "I need you to stop protecting her from consequences," I said. "Whatever happens next, and I am going to pursue this, I need you to not stand in the middle." He agreed. He agreed, and, to his credit, he kept his word. Margaret did not respond to the cease and desist directly. What she did instead was call Daniel, 3 times in the first week, then once more the week after, and in those calls, as he later relayed to me with a flat, drained expression, she had cycled through every available register. Injured innocence. I was simply trying to recover what was mine. Wounded motherhood. I can't believe my own son would allow this. And finally, a hard, stripped-down ultimatum that she perhaps thought would work better than the others. If she files a complaint, I will tell people she fabricated the photograph. I will make this very unpleasant for her. Daniel had said quietly, "Don't," and then he had ended the call. I did not file a criminal complaint in the end. Patricia advised me that the civil remedy was cleaner and more certain, and that the criminal process would be slow and emotionally costly. Instead, I sent a second letter that added the threat documentation to the record and made clear that any public defamation would result in a civil suit. And I filed a formal report with the police about the unauthorized entry, not to pursue charges immediately, but to create a record, to make the shape of what had happened visible and official and documented. The effect was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no scene, no moment of public reckoning. What there was instead was silence, the specific, total silence that descends when someone realizes that the person they were counting on to be too destabilized to fight back has, in fact, organized themselves entirely. Margaret stopped calling Daniel. She did not appear at our door. She did not respond to any further communications from Patricia's office. Helen gave a written statement confirming her memory of the pearls and the date and the occasion. I had the receipt analyzed by a document examiner who confirmed, in writing, that the paper composition was inconsistent with a 1951 production date and that the aging was artificial. I filed those findings alongside Helen's statement with my lawyer and kept a copy in a fireproof box in my study, which is where it remains. Months passed. The lilac bush came back in May, as it always does, in those enormous purple clusters, and the scent came through the kitchen window while I stood at the counter in the evening, and I thought about my grandmother, about the coat she had crossed an ocean in, about the things she had chosen to keep safe, about the note she had tucked inside the velvet lining, with the specific foresight of a woman who had learned not to assume that what was given to you would be allowed to stay. These are yours. Don't let anyone talk you out of them. Daniel and I were still living in the house on Calloway Street. What had changed between us was not something that could be undone quickly or easily. It was the specific damage that comes not from cruelty, but from revealed weakness, from finding out that the person beside you had looked at your interests and his comfort and had chosen, in a quiet and terrible moment, his comfort. We had been to counseling. We were still going. The work of it was slow and sometimes discouraging, and there were evenings when I looked at him across the dinner table and felt the distance of that choice between us like something physical. There were also evenings, more of them gradually, when I could feel the weight of it lifting degree by degree, the way the temperature changes in a room where a window has been opened. I kept the pearls in the rosewood jewelry box on the top shelf of our closet. I wore them, once, to a colleague's retirement dinner, a formal occasion that called for something significant. Standing at the mirror while I fastened the clasp, I thought about my grandmother putting them on, in whatever apartment she had lived in 1946, before any of this, before my father was born, before everything that would follow. I thought about the weight of them, the particular cool heaviness of old pearls against the skin. I thought about how things that survive do so not because nothing threatens them, but because someone, at every stage, decides that they are worth protecting. I decided that, standing at the mirror. I decided it again, and I keep deciding it. That is how it works in the end. Not one large act of defense, but the daily, unglamorous accumulation of small ones. The locked doors, the documented timelines, the lawyer's letters, the fireproof box, the photographs kept safe, the inheritance held steady in both hands, not because it is effortless, but because it is yours, and you know it, and you refuse, with the particular, quiet, unshakable refusal of women who came before you, to let anyone talk you out of it.